I'd always considered myself a reasonably adaptable person. Moving around was practically a hobby for me, a way to shake things up, experience new environments. So, when I bought that charming little house in what seemed like a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, I expected the usual growing pains. You know, the awkward introductions to neighbors, figuring out the unspoken rules of the cul-de-sac, deciphering the cryptic trash collection schedule. What I didn't expect was Karen. The neighborhood itself was deceptively idyllic. Rows of houses with manicured lawns, the kind that seemed to scream conformity in a way that both intrigued and slightly unnerved me. I'm more of a controlled chaos kind of guy when it comes to landscaping. A bit of wildness amidst the order. This place, though, it was order with a capital O, underlined, bolded, and italicized. There was an almost palpable sense of expectation, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for me to either seamlessly blend in or spectacularly fail. I'd chosen the house partly for its slightly quirky character, a little Victorian-era detail here, a slightly overgrown garden there. It was a subtle rebellion against the uniformity, a way to inject a little personality into the otherwise pristine landscape. I figured it would be a good conversation starter, a way to break the ice with the neighbors. I was wrong. Dead wrong. My first encounter with Karen happened on moving day. I was wrestling a ridiculously oversized armchair through the front door, sweat dripping down my forehead, when I heard it, the distinct, sharp click of expensive heels on the pavement. I glanced up to see a woman approaching, her face a mask of carefully constructed disapproval. She was the epitome of the suburban queen bee stereotype. Perfectly coiffed hair, a designer handbag clutched in one hand, and an expression that could curdle milk. "You are aware," she began, her voice dripping with a sugary condescension that instantly set my teeth on edge, "that there are guidelines regarding moving procedures in this community." I blinked, momentarily speechless. "Guidelines?" I managed, trying to keep my voice neutral. "For moving furniture?" She gave me a look that could only be described as withering. Indeed, there are designated hours, approved vehicle types, and of course, protocols for protecting the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. She said aesthetic integrity like it was some sacred ancient text I was on the verge of desecrating. I glanced at my slightly battered moving truck, then back at Karen. I could already tell this was going to be a long and arduous relationship. I had a feeling aesthetic integrity was going to be the least of my worries. I took a mental note. Beneath that polished exterior, there was something else lurking, something calculating. It was in the way her eyes narrowed, the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. This wasn't just about moving protocols. This was personal. And I had a sneaking suspicion I'd just unwittingly stumbled into a war I never asked to be a part of. The seeds for this conflict were clearly there and needed some explanation. This sets the scene, introduces the key players, and establishes the initial conflict. It also hints at the narrator's personality and the underlying tension in the neighborhood. The ending leaves the reader wanting to know more about the war that's brewing. The aesthetic integrity comment, as it turned out, was just the opening salvo in Karen's campaign of low-grade suburban warfare. The following weeks were a masterclass in passive-aggressive neighborly conduct. First came the notes. Little, neatly typed missives, slipped under my door or taped to my mailbox, always signed with a flourish. Karen, HOA compliance. Your lawn appears to exceed the maximum allowable grass height by approximately 0.7 inches. Please rectify immediately. Your trash bins are positioned 1.2 inches too far from the curb. HOA regulations stipulate a precise 1-inch distance. Kindly adhere to the guidelines. The luminosity of your porch light exceeds community standards. Please replace with a lower wattage bulb to avoid disrupting the nocturnal ambiance. At first, I played along. I'm not a confrontational person, and honestly, I found the whole thing mildly amusing. I trimmed the lawn with obsessive precision, using a ruler to measure the grass blades. I adjusted the trash bins with the accuracy of a NASA engineer aligning a satellite dish. I even swapped out my perfectly good porch light for a dim, flickering bulb that barely illuminated the steps. I thought, perhaps naively, that compliance would appease Karen. I was, of course, spectacularly wrong. One evening, while I was meticulously pruning a rose bush, apparently its unruly growth was offensive to the neighborhood's visual harmony, Karen materialized beside me. "You know," she said, her voice a syrupy sweet venom, "the HOA has received multiple complaints about your gardening style." I straightened up, holding a pair of pruning shears. "My gardening style?" I asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of my voice. "Yes," she nodded, her eyes fixed on a perfectly innocent rosebud. "It's rather eccentric." "Eccentric?" I repeated. "It's a rosebush, Karen. I'm pruning it." "But are you pruning it according to the guidelines?" she countered, her smile widening. "There's a specific methodology outlined in the HOA Handbook, Section 4, Paragraph 7, Subsection B." I stared at her. "You're joking, right?" Her smile didn't falter. "The HOA takes these matters very seriously. We strive for uniformity, for a cohesive aesthetic. Your creative approach to landscaping is disruptive." That's when I started to realize this wasn't about grass height or bin placement. This was about control. This was about Karen exerting her self-proclaimed authority. I decided to test the waters. "So, Karen," I said, feigning innocence, "what exactly is the approved way to prune a rosebush?" She launched into a detailed, 15-minute lecture on the proper angle of the cut, the ideal number of leaves to leave on each stem, and the importance of using organic HOA-approved fertilizer. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting her drone on. The absurdity of it all was almost unbearable. The eccentric gardening incident was followed by the inappropriate mailbox decor complaint, a small ceramic frog I'd placed on top, the unauthorized bird feeder warning, apparently it attracted the wrong type of birds, and the truly ridiculous, excessive holiday cheer citation. I'd dared to put up more than the HOA-mandated 3 strands of Christmas lights. Then came the email, the one that took things from petty annoyances to outright absurdity. It was from the HOA compliance team, which, I strongly suspected, was just Karen sitting at her computer in a different room. The subject line: official notice, property non-compliance, potential eviction. My jaw dropped. Eviction? I reread the email, my initial amusement giving way to a slow-burning anger. It was filled with the usual legalese and HOA jargon, but the core message was clear. My property did not align with the established guidelines and aesthetic values of the community, and I had 30 days to vacate or face legal action. The final, chilling line was, "Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings." Foreclosure? This was insane. They couldn't actually do that, could they? I owned the house outright. There was no mortgage, no outstanding debt. But a seed of doubt had been planted. I knew some HOAs were notorious for abusing their power, leveraging fines and obscure bylaws to pressure homeowners. It was a long shot, but what if? That's where my research started and the seed for my counterattack. The next phase was about to begin, and Karen had no idea what was coming. This carefully crafted email was just a little spark to start a big fire. The foreclosure threat, however ludicrous, was the final straw. It lit a fire under me. I spent the next few hours poring over legal documents, HOA bylaws, which I discovered were even more ridiculous than I'd imagined, and property records. My initial anger morphed into a cold, focused determination. Karen had pushed me too far, and now she was going to learn a very valuable lesson about messing with the wrong homeowner. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the HOA's eviction notice was pure bluff. They had no legal standing to evict me, let alone initiate foreclosure proceedings on a property I owned outright. But that didn't mean they couldn't make my life miserable with endless fines and legal harassment. That's when I remembered something, a seemingly insignificant detail from years ago, when I'd first started investing in real estate. It was a long shot, a forgotten piece of my financial past, but it was worth checking. I dug through old files, boxes of paperwork I hadn't touched in years, and then, there it was, the deed, the lease agreement, the whole 9 yards. A slow smile spread across my face. It was almost too perfect. The house Karen was living in, the house she was so desperately trying to control, the house she was using as her little HOA headquarters. It wasn't hers, it was mine. I, through a series of rather astute, if I may say so myself, investment purchases years ago, was her landlord. The irony was exquisite. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, the enforcer of all things aesthetic and compliant, was a renter. And not just any renter, my renter. The eviction notice she'd so gleefully sent me was, in essence, a piece of paper I could legally turn right back around on her. I sat back in my chair, a chuckle escaping my lips. The sheer audacity of it all. She had absolutely no idea. She was so blinded by her own sense of self-importance, so convinced of her power, that she hadn't even bothered to check who actually owned the property she was terrorizing. I pulled up Karen's lease agreement on my computer. It was all there in black and white. Her signature, my signature, as the representative of the holding company, the terms and conditions, the dates, everything. I skimmed through the document, making sure I hadn't missed anything, some obscure clause that could somehow protect her. Nope, it was airtight. And then I found it. The gold mine. Multiple violations of the lease agreement. Harassment of other residents? Check. Numerous documented instances, thanks to her own meticulously crafted complaint notes. Unauthorized alterations to the property? Check. The ridiculous HOA signs she'd plastered all over the front lawn, the approved flower beds she'd installed without permission. It was all there. And then, the pièce de résistance, attempting to interfere with legal property ownership. Oh, that was a big check, a huge, red, underlined check. My initial instinct was to draft a scathing email, a point-by-point rebuttal of her absurd eviction notice, culminating in the glorious reveal. Surprise, Karen, I'm your landlord. But then I stopped. This was too good, too deliciously ironic to waste on an email. This deserved a face-to-face confrontation. This deserved drama. I started formulating a plan. It wasn't enough to simply evict her. I wanted to dismantle her entire little kingdom, to expose her hypocrisy and arrogance to the entire neighborhood. I wanted to make an example of her, and I knew exactly how to do it. It was time for Karen to learn that her reign of terror was over. It was time for a little community meeting, Karen's style, but with a very special guest of honor. The planning was afoot, the tables were set, the pieces arranged. All that was left was the execution. It was going to be the HOA gathering for the decade, and my dear Karen was going to be the highlight of it. The community meeting, as I decided to call it, was set for Saturday afternoon. I'd sent out invitations, actual physical invitations mimicking Karen's own pretentious style, to every resident in the cul-de-sac. The wording was deliberately vague, promising a special announcement regarding the future of our community, and an opportunity to address recent concerns. I even added a little RSVP section, just for good measure. The anticipation, I imagined, was killing Karen. I spent the intervening days meticulously preparing. I printed out copies of Karen's lease agreement, highlighted the relevant sections in bright yellow. I gathered all the evidence of her HOA violations, the notes, the emails, even some photos I'd surreptitiously taken of her unauthorized landscaping projects. I even contacted a local reporter I knew, hinting at a juicy story about HOA tyranny gone wild. He was intrigued, to say the least. Saturday arrived with a glorious, sunny sky, a perfect backdrop for Karen's public humiliation. I set up a small table and chairs on her front lawn, my front lawn, technically, a move that I knew would infuriate her. I even put up a sign, "Community Meeting, All Welcome," in the most garish font I could find. The neighbors started arriving around 2 p.m., a mix of curious onlookers and Karen's few remaining loyalists. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I wanted her to make a grand entrance, to walk into the trap I'd so carefully laid. As the crowd grew, I started chatting with the neighbors, keeping things light and casual. I could sense their confusion, their anticipation. They knew something was up, but they weren't quite sure what. Finally, at precisely 2:15 p.m., Karen emerged from her house, my house. She was dressed in her usual HOA president attire, a stiff navy blue blazer, a perfectly pressed white blouse, and that ever-present expression of smug superiority. She surveyed the scene, her eyes narrowing as she took in the crowd, the table, the sign. And then she saw me. Her face went through a series of rapid transformations. Surprise, confusion, annoyance, and finally a flicker of fear? It was beautiful. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and strained. I stood up, a calm smile playing on my lips. "Welcome, everyone," I announced, my voice amplified by a small portable microphone I'd brought along. "I'm so glad you could all make it today. As you know, there's been some tension in our community lately, primarily concerning our esteemed HOA president, Karen." I gestured towards Karen, who stood frozen, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Karen has been very vocal about upholding community standards," I continued, "about ensuring that everyone adheres to the rules and regulations, and while I appreciate her dedication, I think it's important to ensure that those who enforce the rules are also following them." I paused, letting the suspense build. The neighbors were murmuring, exchanging curious glances. Karen's loyalists were starting to look uncomfortable. "You see," I said, holding up a copy of Karen's lease agreement, "Karen isn't just our HOA president. She's also a tenant, and as it turns out, my tenant." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. "This," I continued, tapping the lease agreement, "is the contract Karen signed when she moved into this house. And this," I said, holding up a stack of papers, "is a detailed list of all the ways she's violated that contract." I proceeded to read out the violations, one by one, citing specific clauses and providing photographic evidence, the harassment of other residents, the unauthorized alterations, the blatant disregard for property ownership. It was all there, laid bare for everyone to see. The crowd was silent, stunned. Karen's loyalists were now actively avoiding eye contact with her. Karen herself was stammering, trying to interrupt, to deny, to deflect, but her words were lost in the overwhelming weight of the evidence. You can't do that," Karen said, finally finding words, though shaky and lacking any semblance of her prior confidence. "Oh, but I can, and I am, and that's not all, Karen," I smirked, handing papers around. "This gathering isn't just for my benefit, it's also for the benefit of our esteemed HOA members. See, this isn't just a lease agreement, it is also, thanks to the fine print, a termination notice, and that, my dearest Karen, is checkmate." The neighbors began murmuring, some covering their mouth to hide a laugh. Karen's face fell, the fight completely extinguished. "Pack your bags, Karen," I finished. The scene was set. The climax had been reached, the fallout, and Karen's final exit were next. The aftermath of the community meeting was, predictably, chaotic. Karen, completely deflated and humiliated, retreated into the house. My house, still my house, refusing to speak to anyone. Her few remaining supporters dispersed quickly, avoiding eye contact and murmuring apologies. The rest of the neighbors, however, were buzzing with excitement. They were finally free from Karen's reign of petty tyranny. The next few days were a blur of activity. Karen, true to form, initially refused to leave. She tried to claim the termination notice was invalid, that I was somehow violating her rights. It was pathetic, really. I simply forwarded her emails to my lawyer, who sent back a very sternly worded letter that finally convinced her to pack her bags. The actual eviction day was surprisingly anticlimactic. No police, no screaming, no dramatic confrontations, just Karen, looking defeated and considerably less glamorous, loading her belongings into a moving truck. She didn't even look at me as she drove away. It was satisfying, in a quiet, understated way. The following week, I received an email from the HOA. It was a notice of a special election to fill the vacant president's seat. They were, shall we say, strongly encouraging me to run. I laughed out loud. The irony was almost too much. Me, HOA president? Never. I politely declined the offer. I had no desire to wield power over my neighbors, to enforce ridiculous rules, or to engage in petty squabbles. I just wanted to live in peace, to enjoy my slightly eccentric garden, and to maybe, just maybe, put up a few extra strands of Christmas lights next year. The neighborhood, however, had changed. There was a lightness, a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. People were friendlier, more relaxed, more themselves. It was as if Karen's departure had lifted a collective weight. As for the husband, turns out he was a local politician. The situation was diffused by my own lawyer. It was a short, sweet conversation, one I wasn't even present. And as for me, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes the best way to fight a bully is to simply own the playground. And maybe also to enjoy a chuckle or two. This story, while humorous, underscores some timeless truths about community and resilience. It reminds us that even in seemingly tranquil settings, power dynamics can become skewed. The Karens of the world exist, those who seek control through petty rules and intimidation. But it also teaches us that quiet strength, patience, and a thorough understanding of one's rights can be powerful tools. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. Know your resources, consult with experts, and remember that sometimes the most effective response is a well-placed, well-timed, and legally sound countermove. Most importantly, it is to remember that the best kind of authority never has to be loudly declared, and the truest of victories allows people to have their dignity.